Welcome back to part 3 of our overview of the British home front. So we've been looking at how government control of industry in particular had to get much stronger in 1915 as it was meeting new challenges on the battlefront. And certainly as that government control increases, we see growing tensions with the trade unions. And in 1916, 17, 18, we see a lot more strikes, work stoppages. Things are not all hunky-dory on the home front, but we need to understand that overall morale was maintained. One of the things that really had to change from 1915 onwards is the role of women in the workforce. We can see here women are being used in a number of different roles. So here we see women's working in the munitions industry in particular, while here we've got women drivers who are driving through the cities and towns, replacing things that used to be done by working class men. Most of the women that we see moving into these kinds of jobs, whether it's a porter, delivering things around the cities, or drivers or bus conductors, they are mostly working class women. And working class women had often worked in the past, particularly the single women. They'd worked as domestic servants, working for the upper class. During World War I, we really start to see a shift in that. The upper class and middle class people can no longer afford to maintain domestic servants. And also, the women are being encouraged to enter into other industries which are absolutely necessary to support the war effort. And so we start to see a real shift in the class makeup in Britain, not as distinct as it used to be. The upper class are cutting back on luxuries as we move through the war. However, we need to understand that there is still a class division, and so most of our working women are actually working class women. Definitely the single women, but we also start to see more and more married working class women. Those who might have in the past have stopped work when they got married and had children, but now they are working, encouraged to come into these industries in order to maintain the war effort. Middle class and upper class women, we can see here, this is an actual recruitment poster encouraging women to join that munitions industry. And we can see that, the man in the background who is desperate, who is requiring her, women in the front, to actually take part in these industries in order to support them on the front line. Our middle class and upper class women tended not to go into factory work. So when we talk about women joining these industries, that's mostly working class women. Our middle class and upper class women tended to take on roles more in caring for the wounded or the recuperating soldiers who were coming home for rest, or those who had been injured and just needed time to recuperate. One of the organisations that took on these volunteers was called the Voluntary Aid Detachment, the VAD. We can see here a recruitment poster for the VAD. They needed nurses, cooks, kitchen maids, clerks, housemaids, all of those kinds of things in order to support these wounded and recuperating soldiers. And we can see here on the right some of these VAD volunteers, nicely dressed, still got the beautiful hats happening. So this is reasonably early in the war. And they're receiving training from the Red Cross, some basic medical training. Not all, because nursing had actually been a professional occupation for women, and certainly not all the nurses appreciated these middle class, upper class women coming along with their limited medical knowledge and taking over these kinds of jobs. But certainly they were needed, they were necessary, and we see a number of middle class and upper class women taking on these roles. Some middle class women did go into the factories as the manpower shortage, our labour shortage, grew worse as the war went on. But we do see a class divide amongst the women of the kinds of roles they would typically take on. As 1916 comes along, we can see here some of the nurses who were professionals themselves, not just volunteers, but actual professionals who gave a lot during the war, working close to the front lines as well as on the home front in order to provide absolutely essential medical services to the soldiers. One of the things that happens as we start to move into 1916 is we actually start to see a shortfall in the recruitments. So very successful recruitment campaigns were conducted in 1914 and 1915. And we've talked a little about Kitchener's army. There's Lord Kitchener here. We've talked about Kitchener's army that was recruited and had limited training as they went into 1916. But the numbers voluntarily joining really start to drop off in 1915. And therefore the British government introduced conscription. That is the compulsory undertaking of military service. The law to introduce conscription is brought in January 1916, and at first it's aimed just at the single men aged 18 to 41, but eventually, well, in fact, not that long after, by May 1916, it's extended to cover all married men as well. This is how bad the numbers were. There's a number of reasons why voluntary recruitment was dropping off. Firstly, a very large number of the men who were fit and were able to join had already gone off with their pals or otherwise to join the front line. Many of the men that hadn't yet joined up were either very unfit and not really the kind of soldiers that they wanted to recruit, or they were working in key industries like the munitions industry, and the employers and the government were reluctant to let them go because these were such vital industries. However, the casualties experienced in 1915 were so high that it was absolutely essential for the British Army to keep replenishing numbers. And we can see here on the right a sign introducing the Military Service Act of 1916 and explaining the choices available to a young man. This is early in the year, so it's still an unmarried man, but from May 1916 it applied to married men as well. So nobody can be accepted, nobody can be exempted. You've got one or two choices. It's effectively forcing them to join up at once. Don't put it off, enlist at once, or you can attest, which basically means to fill in a piece of paper to show your willingness to join as your number is called up. Of course, if you don't do one of these two things, you're going to be caught anyway, because you're going to be deemed to have enlisted, and eventually your group, you will be allocated to a group and you will be called up to join the army and fulfill your military service. So conscription was conducted, but even with conscription, you still had to complete medical examinations and pass fitness tests. And the sad thing for the British government is that they didn't actually increase their recruitment rates that much with conscription because there were such high numbers of men from Britain that ended up exempted due to physical unfitness. Many of these were men from the working class, particularly from the cities, those who'd suffered years of malnutrition, squalid housing, industrial disease, which had affected their growth and affected their physical fitness so much that they weren't considered fit to be soldiers. These kinds of men were left behind and were expected to undertake, work in vital industries to support the war effort. You can see here some men who are now being fitted out with their uniforms ready to go off. There was another option available under British law, which was not available in many other countries, and that was something called conscientious objection. That is, you could claim that your religion and your beliefs were so strongly against war that you were not able to fight on the front line. The democratic system of Britain incorporated this into the law, but the conscientious objectors were not treated well. And you can see from this particular poster that the conscientious objector, this one here, is really being portrayed as quite an effeminate, skinny, unfit young thing, saying, "Oh, you naughty, unkind German. Really, if you don't desist, I'll forget. I've got a conscience, and I'll smack you on the wrist." So you can see the tone that this particular poster is attributing to anybody who dares to call themselves a conscientious objector. Conscientious objectors had to put their application before a court. Many were knocked back. Those that were accepted as conscientious objectors still had to undertake some kind of work. Some of them had to go and do not fighting activities, but more cleaning and those kinds of activities near the front line. Others stayed in Britain doing farming work, those kinds of things. Those who very seriously objected were thrown into prison for a certain amount of time. As the war goes on and the U-boat blockade continues to be successful, we start to see some problems with food resources in Britain. You can see this photo here showing a shop putting up a sign, "No more goods expected today." And this one here on the right, very much working class women gathered, still looking quite cheerful, but they are having to line up to purchase their goods. Food and coal were the particular resources that were affected by the blockade. Things such as sugar, butter, tea and margarine were things which people had to queue for. As we go through 1916, there's a particularly bad harvest, a bad growing season. And so Britain's really starting to struggle to supply itself and is not able to be supported by the imports due to the U-boat blockade. In April 1916, things are getting so bad that Britain believed that it only had 6 weeks of wheat supply left. And with bread as a staple part of the diet, this was getting to the point where Britain was getting desperate to break open the blockade. So by the end of 1916, there's a huge concern in Britain. 1916 is also the year that we see the Battle of the Somme, and people are really starting to question how the war was being fought. And with this growing pressure on the government, both from the battlefront and from the home front, the Prime Minister, Asquith, is forced to resign. He's seen as not having the right planning skills, the right organisational skills to get Britain to survive through this war. And so he's replaced by somebody who did show himself through 1915 and 1916 to be a successful organiser, to get things done. And this is this guy, David Lloyd George. So Prime Minister Lloyd George takes the helm from December 1916, which is when this particular cartoon was published, showing him as the new conductor about to begin the 1917 overture, see if he can lead and organise and conduct Britain with more vigour and more success than his predecessor. Under the new Prime Minister, we have the Ministry of Food created in December 1916, which is an important way to try to regulate the supply of food and also the consumption of food. The other thing they did was try to encourage more food production in Britain itself. The National Service Women's Land Army had actually been started back in 1915, but gets a massive boost with this new emphasis on food production in Britain. By 1917, there were over 250,000 women, many of them from the cities, who were now working on the land, replacing the agricultural labour which had gone off to the battlefront. And this, as well as a number of other measures that we'll look at in the next mini lecture, really helped Britain to get back on its feet.